many people even perceive themselves to be having healthy eating habits. But when you actually break it down with them, it's not that they're eating unhealthy. They really are making an effort. And I always want to champion efforts that people make, because change is hard and it's not a perfect world. But they often don't realize something simple, like my patient Bill, something simple that they're doing. They almost do it in an automatic fashion. And when we are not having that level of awareness connected to what we're doing, is often when we get ourselves in trouble. And that's when we have to, we uncover things that they're doing. But as consumers, we just really have to understand food labels and understand that 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon, because our food labels are in grams, and we cook and bake in the United States, and all our cookbooks are standardized to pounds and ounces. So it's very, very difficult for us to try to figure out a food label, without knowing a few tips.
I would love for you to share with the listeners, because you have very much a Renaissance background. How did you go from medical school into becoming a chef and a nutrition-focused psychiatrist? Because let's fully recognize that traditional kind of allopathic medicine is still very focused on medications that are going to treat symptoms, as opposed to looking at a more root cause approach.
Absolutely. So certainly my background is different, but it goes back to my childhood. When I thought about it, I realized that there were several very strong influences. I grew up in a very large South Asian family, surrounded by grandparents and parents and cousins, and lots of a very large extended family. But I decided, Cynthia, to skip out of preschool, and I preferred to stay home with my maternal grandmother, to whom my book, This Is Your Brain on Food, is dedicated. Mm-hmm. So the book is dedicated to her. But she was a wonderful cook, and I would spend time during the day with her, because my mom was actually in medical school at the time. So my parents would leave me with my grandmother during the day, and we'd do things like, pick fresh vegetables from the garden. I'd help her shell peas and do all sorts of things, and she would prepare a meal. So it was very much part of my DNA. It was how I grew up. But at the same time, there were several other very positive influences. My grandparents taught me how to meditate. They taught me yoga. And in this very large extended family, there were lots of uncles and aunts who were physicians. So there was the talk of science, there's talk of nutrition. There's also love and joy and nurturance around the home. And I grew up with this influence of allopathic physicians, as well as a few Ayurvedic practitioners. So that holistic approach and mind-body approach was all there. And when I began to really learn about psychiatric medications, I realized that there was such a huge gap, because there wasn't any speak of anything holistic. There wasn't any discussion of the mind-body connection. And I think that the power of the prescription pad also led me to feel that I owed it to my patients to have just a few more options for them in the toolkit, not against medications, actually, that work very well with medications. And nutrition became one of those things early on. And for me, it really happened, that aha moment actually happened for me when I began to delve deeper into nutrition, when a patient yelled at me, which in some ways was also a very enlightening moment for him. And I was a very timid, young resident, and just learning about medications and prescribing. And he accused me of causing him to gain weight from Prozac. And of course, technically that is true, but I had his chart up on my computer, and I knew that wasn't the case. I knew his baseline weight. And the Boston area, our favorite coffee is Dunkin' Donuts coffee, if you've ever been to the New England area. And well, let's call him Bill. He had this very large cup of coffee in his hand. So as he was yelling, I looked at this coffee, and I said to him, Bill, what did you put in your coffee? And that did distract him, but I realized something had clicked in my head. And he said, oh, well, I put what I always put, Doc, my packets of sugar and my cream, or whatever it is, or cream, I should say. But when we sat down at the computer, we worked out he put more than a quarter cup of processed creamer and 8 teaspoons of sugar, at least. And when I'm not much of a calorie counter, Cynthia. In fact, I don't always think it's helpful for people. But when we use that method just to outline to him what he had taken in just with his coffee before he'd even eaten. And it as the light bulb went off for him, and I saw his attitude change, his behavior, his demeanor change towards me. He suddenly was engaged in, well, how can we work together to change this? Like, help me understand what I'm doing, even in the rest of my meals. that was my aha moment, because I saw the power of translating a simple educational fact about a habit he had every day that could be powerful in his life. And when someone wants to make a change, or they see that there is a potential food or drink or beverage that is affecting them, that is very powerful. And it really led me to want to do more of that and ask more questions. And I just felt that I should be asking people, are you moving? Are you sleeping well? Are you drinking enough water? So that began to be what I started to ask about. And I was very fortunate to be encouraged in my interest, both from my parents early on, but also in my training. And I was supported by my mentors to open this clinic at Mass General and to really serve individuals who want to use nutritional interventions to improve their mental well-being. And that's how my clinic in nutritional and metabolic psychiatry started. It was also how the book came to be. But it's been I think and I should just say on this very long answer that I didn't mean for it to be so long, but my food hero was Julia Child. And when I was a very junior resident, I would watch her on PBS because, which resident can only afford public television and not cable. And she really helped me gain confidence as a cook, And so I decided, when I realized it was her second career that she was most famous for, I thought, well, why not learn more, and why can't I do it, sort of thing. So I decided to pursue that as well.
Well, I love that you married all of these background influences together. And it's a really powerful realization as a clinician when your patients give you opportunities to think a little bit differently. Like that day when you recall that patient and you connecting over what he had put in his coffee. And I like to remind, when I'm working with people, just the realization that there are a lot of habits that we have that can add up over time. And all of my background, I was an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore and worked in cardiology as an MP for 16 years. And I got to a point where, and the listeners know this, that I kept saying, it can't just be about writing prescriptions. We really have to be spending the time. And as an NP, I had the luxury of a little bit more time with my patients. And one patient in particular that I like to talk a lot about was a diabetic. And he went to the diabetes educator, and the diabetes educator thought she was providing really helpful information. And so I said, what do you eat in a given day? And this is a diabetic, said, I eat 6 bananas a day. And I said, okay. And I said, what did the diabetes educator talk to you about fruit sugar? And he said, oh, well, it's a natural food. And I said, it is. But if you've already got a blood sugar problem, eating more fructose, even though it's a fruit, and having so many carbohydrates is not beneficial. And for him, he actually said to me, years later, he said, you were the first person that actually said to me, do you think maybe you're eating too much fruit? Like too much of any one thing.
Any one thing, right?
May not be beneficial. So I love that you have those discussions, because I think it's so critically important. It can't be that, and let me be clear for everyone that's listening, there are absolutely positively times when the only option is prescription medication or surgical intervention. But when it comes to chronic disease or preventative disease, whether that's mental or physical, it's really important that we're opening up these discussions, because we may not know how many sugars our patient is putting in their coffee or how many pieces of fruit they're having that they think are entirely benign, and yet they're diabetic. So let's talk a little bit, let's unpack. There's a lot of discussion about the role between mental health and gut health, and, really talking to people that there is this interplay, the enteric second brain. Let's touch on this, because I think this realization is really important for people, that the foods that we're eating are very powerful because it can impact the chemicals that our gut makes, our neurotransmitters, et cetera. And oftentimes our choices in terms of foods, whether it's things we consume in beverage form or, physical food that we're chewing and swallowing, have a large impact on how we feel, how we see the world.
Absolutely. It's if someone went to medical school a few decades ago, they were not taught the gut-brain connection. And it's really in the last decade to 2 decades that things have really unfolded in the research around the gut-brain connection, gut health, the microbiome. In fact, between 2013 and 2017, there were about 12,000 journal articles published in this area. So it really speaks to this cutting edge level of research. And also, I think the way that what I'm excited about is the way that it's impacting mental health. Because, as my patients will tell me, the gut and brain are not close by in the body. Why would you even think they were connected? And they're absolutely right. It's a fair question. But when you break it down and discuss the fact that embryologically, the gut and brain arise from the exact same cells, develop, divide, and grow apart in the body, and then remain connected by the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, which I like to call two-way superhighway. And I call it that because it works 24/7, 365 days a day, a year, 365 days a year. But, transmitting these chemical messages back and forth in a bidirectional way between these two organs. People start to understand that what they're eating can, in fact, have an impact. And then understanding that the medications, like my patient Bill was taking, Prozac, Zoloft, are all selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but about 90% of those receptors are actually in the gut. Mm-hmm. So that is often why people will understand then if you've ever been prescribed an SSRI medication, you may have for the first 5 to 10 days, a little bit longer, some GI upset or GI discomfort. And then, for the pandemic times, I always like people to know that 70% or more of our immune system is in the gut. And that's really important for people to understand that as we eat, the breakdown products of our food, I say, you can eat a healthier choice or a less healthy choice. If you're choosing the fast food, junk foods, processed foods, it's going to have an impact on your microbiota. And we know that those microbes change within 24 hours. You may not feel the change, but they start to change. They start to respond. They start to react. So if you are feeding the bad guys with, the ice cream and the sugar and the fast processed foods all the time, then they are thriving and they overcome the good guys who are there to, eat the fiber-rich foods and help you thrive and help your immunity, help your circadian rhythm, help your sleep, help hormone balance, help your immunity, help your, mental health. But if you don't feed them right, they can't really do their job. So it's important to understand that balance and that imbalance when we are not eating a healthy diet is what really sets us up for inflammation in the gut. And inflammation in the gut, I like to say a happy gut is a happy mood, because the opposite is also true. If it's a not happy gut or an unhappy gut, there's inflammation. But most importantly, that inflammation sets up for brain or neuroinflammation. And you will see over time an uptick of someone's mental health symptoms or new onset of symptoms in some people too. And so you really have to understand what's going on with the whole person and what they're doing with all their habits, not just are they taking their medication twice a day, but what else is going on in their life.
That's really powerful. There's a lot that you said in that short, well, not short answer, but in that very detailed answer, how critically important we're still in the midst of a pandemic, kind of on the, I keep saying on the tail end. I'm hopeful we're heading out of this, but the net impact over what's occurred over the last 15, 16 months for so many people that were not able to be as social as they would have liked to have been, not been able to, go to a baseball game, go to a concert, travel with ease. Things are still a little bit mucked up. And the impact of the food choices that we make are so profoundly powerful. Now, I can probably guess what some of the more inflammatory foods, but based on the research, what are the foods that you see that create the most problems? You touched on some of the hyper palatable, highly processed foods, but what are some of the other big categories? Because there may be people listening who may not make the connection with the foods that they're eating and the net impact on their mood.
Absolutely. Cynthia, as you well know, many people will go into their practitioner's office and talk about a family history of diabetes, those COVID pounds that everyone has, mostly everyone has gained, or even a family history of hypertension. But no one is actually making that connection, right, between what we eat and our emotional health. And I think that one of the ways that people also understand food is that, they know that similarly to hypertension or weight gain, they're concerned about those processed foods or added sugars in foods or sort of more sugary treats as something that would affect their blood sugar. But no one actually realizes that all of these foods actually impact your mental health, and it shows in studies. So added and refined sugars impact your mental health. They at least worsen depression. There's an increase in anxiety. Ultra processed junk foods and fast foods same sort of thing. The more preservatives, the worse for your brain. Artificial sweeteners, many people feel that, let me try to give up this soda and I'll have a diet soda instead. Not the best move, especially if you have mental health symptoms, they could worsen. Processed vegetable oils. So, processed vegetables oils are often used in fast food restaurants where they are, because they're less costly. And
Mm-hmm.
for that reason, if you're eating a fast food, junk food diet, you're consuming very pro-inflammatory oils that are going to disrupt your gut microbiota and start to, set you up for inflammation there. Trans fats have been associated
Mm-hmm.
with behavioral changes. So, it's really sort of uh, avoiding the processed, ultra processed junk foods, fast foods, added and refined sugars, artificial sweeteners is a big category, processed vegetable oils is another one. And, just sort of moving toward a healthy whole foods diet that's rich in fiber.
It's interesting. I was listening to a talk that Dr. Ben Bickman was giving recently, and he said in the United States, the most consumed fat is soybean oil. So you're talking about vegetable oils,
Mhm.
seed oils, and
Yes,
how incredibly inflammatory they are.
yes.
I know from Dr. Kate Shanahan's work, she talks a lot about the fact that these seed oils drive carbohydrate addiction, which leads to insulin resistance. And, the big takeaway from what we're saying is just really get diligent about reading food
Mm,
labels, how critically
yeah.
important. We're not saying to live in a bubble, but
Hmm.
when you're out at a restaurant,
Hmm.
ask, what is that
Hmm.
salad dressing made with? I know I have teenagers and they think I'm the most embarrassing human being in the world. But when we're at a restaurant and we don't eat out a lot, I will
Hmm.
ask, what
Hmm.
are things fried in? What are
Yeah.
your salad dressings made with? And 9 times out of 10, yeah, no, I would say 99% of the time it's canola oil blends, olive oil blends, soybean oil. And I always say thank you, but no thank you. But
Right.
I think that when people are able to make the connection that these foods that they're consuming, oftentimes the hyper palatable foods, they're in travel mode, they're running into a grocery store and just grabbing something they can throw into their bag, oftentimes is not benefiting their physical or emotional health. I know that when my boys were younger, anytime my now 13-year-old ingested red dye number 40 at a birthday party,
Mm,
the brightly
mm,
pigmented red
mm,
icing that, you get at a birthday party, my
mm,
child could not sit still. And my husband, God bless him, used
mm,
to tell me he thought I was bananas. And I said, just let him eat that cupcake and see what happens to his
mhm,
behavior. He couldn't sit down. He
mhm,
normally, in my well-behaved toddler, could not sit down, couldn't sit still, was running all over the place, running amok. And so just
mm,
acknowledging that the chemicals our bodies are exposed to can lead to behavioral changes. And
yeah.
I'm sure for you, I would imagine you see quite a bit of anxiety and depression related to food choices that people are making.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's really many people even perceive themselves to be having healthy eating habits. But when you actually break it down with them, it's not that they're eating unhealthy. They really are making an effort. And I always want to
Mhm.
champion efforts that people make because change is hard and it's not a perfect world. But they often, Cynthia, don't realize something simple, like my patient Bill, something simple that they're doing. They almost do it in an automatic fashion. And when we are not having that level of awareness connected to what we're doing, is often when we get ourselves in trouble. And that's when we uncover things that they're doing
Mhm.
in their daily habits, such as drinking fruit juice. They've heard fruit juice, they should be eating their servings of fruit. So when they see ads that say, get your servings of fruit, they think, well, my doctor said I should eat fruit, and they go out and buy store-bought orange juice. And one of the things I harp on is eat the whole orange, skip the store-bought orange juice, because all the added sugars and lack of fiber doesn't help you. So simple things like that we end up uncovering in their diet. Or, I've heard blueberries are healthy for my brain. They have antioxidants, but they're getting a sugar laden fruited yogurt,
Mhm.
which in a half a cup or just over a half a cup can have 8 to 10 teaspoons of sugar in it. If you buy, different brands. So,
Mhm.
I think that even the brands have gotten savvy and they're trying to cut back on that. But as consumers, we just really have to understand food labels and understand that 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon, because our food labels are in grams, and we cook and bake in the United States, and all our cookbooks are standardized to pounds and ounces. So, so it's very, very difficult for us to try to figure out a food label, without
Yes.
knowing a few tips.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to meet people where they are. I think you bring up such an
Yeah,
excellent point that, we can sit in the ivory tower in academics
yeah,
or, in
yeah,
our
yeah.
clinics, and then we forget it's all about those small sustainable changes. And the only
That's
way
right.
to make them small and sustainable is to make them small. You don't want to go from 0 to 60 because then it will make it very hard to be compliant. Now, it seems to me that a lot of what I hear women in particular, especially women in midlife, is talking a lot about brain health, brain
Hmm.
fog, feeling
Hmm.
like they just don't feel cognitively as clear.
Yeah. Hmm.
What are some of the gender differences that you see clinically with women and men in terms of the mental health impact, not just of our current circumstances in the pandemic, but as our brains are getting older, as our bodies are getting older, what are some of the differences that you're seeing in women?
I think the biggest difference that I see in women is that they might actually struggle a little bit more in different age groups, say around childbearing years.
Mm-hmm.
If they're struggling with anything related to hormone imbalance,
Mm-hmm.
or any form of treatment they might be taking, and then as they are in perimenopause as well. They may have an uptick of anxiety, new onset of symptoms related to what they're experiencing, all the changes that they're going through, and those tend to be two particular groups. But at the rest of the time, I often see a very large amount of anxiety as well, and many unspoken, unseen symptoms, not realizing that they've actually experienced a form of trauma that they never really thought about in that way. But when they share a particular event, a story, or some of their background, they may actually be having symptoms of that trauma, stress related symptoms, or just reactive symptoms, and not really almost put it in the context that it was a traumatic event. Something as simple as, I think sometimes people confuse trauma with either physical trauma or very deep emotional trauma. But trauma comes in many different forms. It can be a young child, as I evaluated once, who was called out for having a learning disability in childhood in a classroom, and developed, then already had a speech impediment, but it became so much worse that he couldn't get up and stand up and speak in front of his class. But he had been evaluated and gone through several medical tests and seen several doctors over many years. And when I saw him later on in his life as an adolescent, when I listened to what his mother said, I realized that this child had really suffered this immense trauma that had almost made him so afraid to speak out that his not only did his learning go awry, but his speech impediment got worse, and he couldn't express himself. So it's important just to understand the whole person, their whole life, and to put it together in that context.
I think that's really important. I think even as a clinician myself, that, when I went through my training and I trained at a big research institution, when I thought of trauma, I thought, oh, medical trauma, or someone's
Yeah,
had a rape or some type of
that's
horrific
right.
event.
Yeah.
And what I've come to realize is that it's very bio-individual. And trauma could have
Hmm.
been the divorce you grew up with your
Yes.
parents.
Hmm.
Trauma could have been a traumatic breakup you had as a young adult. Trauma could
Yes.
be just the stress of a move. And
Hmm.
so acknowledging that each of us experience those things so very
That's
differently,
right.
and how critically important it is to give ourselves grace. I think that's
Yeah.
the one thing. As I'm in my middle age years, I just acknowledge, just give yourself some grace, because there are so many things
Absolutely.
that impact our ability to view the world. Now, one thing I'd love to touch on before we talk about some of the things that we can proactively do to impact cognitive and brain health, let's talk about, let's at least touch on libido and how the foods that we eat and the stress that we experience can impact libido in negative ways.
Absolutely. So, it's one of the things, the reason I included this particular chapter is that individuals who are taking certain psychiatric medications may actually struggle with the side
Mhm.
effect of a lowered libido. And so I felt that was important, but also because it's not only just a part of life, I think that it's helpful for people to know that they can lean on food.
Mhm.
For all of these things in life. So, some of the things that you want to think about are what to include in a date night, foods that you can start to incorporate in your diet. And they can be as simple as things like, one that people love are things like dark chocolate because it boosts oxytocin. It's rich in magnesium. It has multiple essential, amino acid. Red wine is actually associated with this as well. And nuts such as, certain ones hit
Mhm.
the high notes, the pistachios, almonds, and walnuts. Apples, pomegranate juice, to name a few, avocados is a healthy fat. And some herbs and spices were saffron and fenugreek. So, just things that the way I like to people to think about it is what are these, to read the books on the list and the way sorry, to read the list in my book, but the way that I think about it is every chapter has a list of foods to embrace, which is much
Mhm.
longer than the foods to avoid. So, look at the list and see what can I add into a dish, or what can I put together for an evening, and really bring it together that way, and then also be aware of the things to avoid.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. The one thing that I always remember about walnuts and pomegranates is that walnuts look like our brain. I mean, the way that they're shaped. And I always think of pomegranates as like the fertility, fruit. Like it really just looks very ripe and there's lots of
Mm-hmm.
seeds. And so acknowledging that nature does this really beautiful job on so many levels with
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that you've mentioned, that are designed to call our attention to them. Now, I definitely want to touch on the role of, foods and things that are beneficial for cognitive and brain health. And I know this
Mm-hmm.
is a large focus of your book. And for people that are
Mm-hmm.
listening, I'm loving your book. I've been listening to it on Audible so I can
Thank you.
listen to it while I'm outside walking my dogs. I always say like, that brain connection for me, like I'm walking them outside and we're in
Right,
nature. And it's really
right.
something I look forward to. Let's talk about some of the easy things that people can pull into their diets that have a positive net impact on brain health.
Hmm. Absolutely. So, if we're thinking specifically about cognition, we want to bring in those healthy fats like olive oil. We want to think about certain herbs and spices, turmeric with a pinch of black pepper, cinnamon, saffron, rosemary, ginger, and sage with some of those that actually, again, showed up in a very positive way. People that are dealing with brain fog, some of my tips around that, people will report feeling very sluggish in the afternoon. I always suggest to them a couple of things. One is a mood kind of clarifying green tea because the L-theanine and it's so rich in antioxidants and polyphenols that it actually many people find it gives them a little bit of an energy boost that helps them focus. But you can also use foods which are rich in certain antioxidants, such as fresh peppermint. So one of the things I'll ask my clients to do is make fresh peppermint tea, eat some sweet peppers, eat certain foods that are rich in luteolin, which is one of the antioxidants that was shown to be helpful with brain fog. So it's sort of a it's sort of, so it's a pattern of healthy eating. And if people are concerned about cognition, I would start with some basic healthy habits, increasing those fruit and vegetable servings, at least two servings of low glycemic fruit like berries, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries was a good idea. But then really having, and to your point, Cynthia, about the caveat around diabetes, you should be talking to your endocrinologist, your diabetologist about that, because he or she may want you to adjust that fruit based on what's going on with your blood sugar. But for the rest of us who may not have those conditions, things like paying attention to fiber, paying attention to enough servings of fruit. It turns out that only 10% of Americans eat their servings of fruit and vegetables, but everyone is always concerned about protein content. So, I'm a fiber champion. It's like, it's important to be getting fiber, which we can only get from fruit, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, healthy whole grains. And I think that if we're not consuming those, we, for whatever reason, we should rethink this, because fiber is really important. Of course, people who have IBS, SIBO, and other GI conditions have to be a little bit careful. They may not be able to tolerate what others do. But again, it's sort of paying attention to those whole healthy foods again that are critical.
I think it's really beneficial to talk a little bit about fiber, because I feel, and I agree with you, that there's been this concern slash bastardization for some of these products. And I always remind people that the way to really stabilize our blood sugar is to focus on protein and some healthy fats and non-starchy
Hmm.
vegetables. But when we're talking about fiber, let's talk about what fiber beneficially does in the gut, so that people
Hmm.
understand we're not just saying this so that you go
Right,
out and feel like you're eating foods that make you feel gassy. You don't necessarily have to eat
right,
a lot of them for them to be
right,
beneficial, but they're,
right.
prebiotics and probiotic rich foods and fiber dense foods are really helpful. But let's talk about some of the benefits to the gut microbiome.
Absolutely. So, fiber is really food for those gut microbiota, and it's not just bacteria. There are different types of organisms down there, but fiber tends to be something that nurtures them and something they can really thrive on. Prebiotic foods, quite simply, things like the allium family, garlic, leeks, and onions, asparagus, bananas, oats, and a few others, actually many others. And then, paying attention to adding in fermented foods to the diet. What they do is they bring live active bacteria back to this environment of the gut. And how we want to think about it, Cynthia, is that by taking care of those microbes, they thrive, they can function for our better health. So we're giving them an opportunity to do their job, but do it well by feeding them well. At the same token, like I said earlier, when we feed the wrong types of organisms down there, bad bugs, is when we set up for inflammation. What fiber also allows these microorganisms to do is break down the food into positive substances for our body, things like short chain fatty acids. And when we eat the more junk foods, fast foods, they break down into more harmful toxic substances in the body. And the gut lining is just one single cell layer thin. The cells are held together by tight junctions. We can't see this with the naked eye; it's all microscopic, but when you think about it, as inflammation may get set up with that sort of maybe fast food diet, it's very easy to start to get a leaky gut, because it's such a simple, thin layer of cells that lines the gut. And as you start to produce more toxic substances, sometimes what happens is people develop what is called a leaky gut, which is actually intestinal permeability. So that's where fiber just is a very positive substance for most of us, understanding that those with some gut issues may struggle a little bit with fiber. And like you said, you don't have to eat a ton of it, but make sure you have good servings during your day, throughout your day, so that you're always charged with a lot of fiber in your body. The other way in which fiber is super useful is that it evens out the blood sugar for individuals with anxiety. So rather than a blood sugar level that's spiking or all over the place, it just complex carbohydrates that are rich in fiber will break down more slowly and evenly in your body. And when that happens, you are emotionally more on an even keel. So there's another tip right there about the fiber as well.
I think it's really important. I think I read a statistic that the average American consumes, I think it was 3 fruits for every 1 vegetable, non-starchy vegetable. And really it should be
Mm,
flipped, that we should be
mm,
having more non-starchy vegetables than fruit, but fruit is sweet and fruit is designed
mhm.
to be very sweet. So it's this hyper
Right.
palatable, relatively healthy thing. I'll give you an example.
Mhm,
I have teenage
mhm,
boys who eat
mhm.
like locusts, and cotton candy grapes are in season for like 2 weeks out of the year. And it's the only
Mm,
time I'll let them eat them. And
right.
we went through 3 pounds. These two
Mm,
boys went through three
mhm.
pounds of grapes overnight. And I said to them, inherently it's a piece of fruit and it's not
Mhm.
inherently a bad thing, but you have both
Right.
consumed, I don't know how many cups of grapes in
Right.
24 hours.
Yes. Yes.
And so we need to balance out, like tonight you're getting broccoli and you're probably getting another non-starchy vegetable to kind of
Right.
balance out all the fruit
Right.
that you've consumed. But I love and would love for you to kind of touch on, we talked about the nutrition piece. What are some of the lifestyle pieces, because in addition
Mhm.
to the nutrition piece, that are absolutely critical when you're working with your patients to help tailor into the anxiety, depression, if people are dealing with trauma or
Hmm.
OCD, behaviors, what are some of the other things they can do in terms of their lifestyle that can beneficially impact their mental and emotional health?
Absolutely. Lifestyle factors are hugely important. So thank you for touching on that. Nutrition is one of the strongest lifestyle factors that has an impact on mental health as well as metabolic diseases, like we've touched on. But when we think about lifestyle, it can be things that I consider to be very important to be speaking to my patients about include how are they sleeping. A lack of sleep is associated with an increased or enhancement of mental health symptoms. And the pandemic has been very bad on people's sleep, so much so that we're calling it coronasomnia now. So it's something to pay attention to, but also things like hydration, having enough glasses of water during the day. Dehydration can be associated with depression. Someone who is dehydrated could become or feel more anxious, and not realize what it is. One of the components is that they could have or should have been drinking more water that day. It's also when someone is severely depressed, I won't talk to them about a certain number of minutes of exercise, but I will talk to them about whether they can walk their dog, pick up the newspaper, walk to the local store for a cup of coffee, just to be out of bed and moving. And when they latch on to such ideas, when you can start to build in more of a lifestyle plan as they start to feel better. So all of these things become important, sleep hygiene, hydration, how are we moving, and also mindfulness and meditation are hugely important. So, someone can practice the kind of meditation that works for them, being mindful about their food, mindful eating, all of that is super important.
Well, I love that you grew up in an environment where the parasympathetic or the rest and repose side of your health was really so nurtured. And I think people
Yeah.
are oftentimes surprised to recognize that, the simple act of digesting our food really starts in the parasympathetic side of our body, the rest and repose. So if we're super stressed out and we're in the car and we're in traffic, or we're yelling at our significant other or our kids,
Hmm.
and you're
Hmm.
trying to eat a meal, you're really setting yourself up to make it a whole lot harder for your body to
Yeah.
digest, break down, and assimilate that food. So really focusing in on the lifestyle piece, I think, is so critically important
Hmm.
and generally underappreciated. As it
Yes.
focuses in on sleep, I talk a lot about the fact that, when I look at studies, if you sleep less than 6 hours a night,
Hmm.
your ability to control your blood sugar, this is just one thing,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
reduced by 60%. And I
Wow.
always say, when we're stressed and we don't have enough sleep, we don't crave broccoli. We're going to crave, hyper palatable carbs. We're going to crave
Right.
sugary stuff, because it's going to give us a little bit of a, serotonin boost. So we feel
Right.
good, at least
Right.
temporarily.
Temporarily. Yeah.
And then, after the fact, we really won't. It goes without saying, there's one patient that sticks in my mind so significantly. This is a young man who had been put on benzodiazepine. So for anyone
Hmm.
that's listening, young man who had been put on low dose Xanax for years and
Hmm.
years and years. Obviously not mentally my first line of thought process for addressing anxiety and
Right.
depression. And what was amazing for this young man was that when he pulled gluten out of his diet,
Mm.
his anxiety and depression went away, and he
Hmm.
really liked
Hmm.
beer. So this was a very
Hmm.
much a hardship for him. But
Hmm.
we used to have these very open conversations
Yep.
about how profoundly powerful it can be
Hmm.
when you are dealing with, a chronic, mental health disorder. And for anyone that's listening, whether we talk about OCD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, etc.,
Hmm.
these are no different than having high blood pressure or diabetes. I mean, these are
Absolutely.
real. These things can be, for a lot of people, can really impact their ability
Mm.
to go about their day without, fixating on symptoms and really not
Right.
feeling well. So has it been your experience that, when the sleep is dialed in, when they're moving their bodies, when they're
Yeah.
eating better choices of food, people probably have a completely life altering perception of their disease system?
They really do, Cynthia, and it's magical to see, because when they start to connect those dots and they want to make more healthy habit changes, slowly but over time, is when they really start to make it a lifestyle. So
Mhm.
they live the lifestyle rather than trying to follow a checklist. If I need to do this, so I need to eat that. And that becomes, I think, is one of the most powerful things, because when people make these slow and steady changes over time and they see the proven benefit in their own bodies, they speak to their doctors or they go in for their checkups and things have improved and they're lowering the dose of a medication, or they're having an adjustment in the amount of insulin they need. That's hugely powerful, and I think where we can't get stuck is this all or none
Mhm.
sort of mentality we sometimes have in this country, with diet wars, or different pieces of information pointing to one kind of diet that will cure everything and save the world. Rather just eat healthy whole foods, and
Mhm.
include components that you like from different diets, and most importantly, include the important foods that will help you feel better.
Mhm. Well, I think it can be for a lot of people incredibly powerful to be able to make those connections that their food really does impact their mood rather
Yeah.
profoundly. It goes without saying that over the course of the last 4 years, there is no one listening that hasn't had more stress and anxiety than they had previously. Obviously, the impact of the pandemic has been quite profound. And clinically, as a psychiatrist, what are some of the trends that you are still seeing at this point, 4 years later, in terms of mental health and anxiety?
So, I think that's a really great question, because one of the things that people don't realize is anxiety disorder has always been the most common mental illness in the world, even prior to the pandemic. But after COVID-19, anxiety disorders grew from about 298 million people to about 374 million people, which actually showed an increase of about 25%. And this was published in a highly reputable journal called Lancet. So it turns out that not only is the data backing up what our human experiences of our friends, family, colleagues, co-workers, perhaps everyone that we're interacting with, but it's quite significant. And I think that the concerning thing, Cynthia, is that we also know that globally, more than 70% of people with mental illness, they never receive treatment from mental health staff or even healthcare staff. So there is a huge gap in the number of practitioners available for this type of work, and then the increase of this disorder worldwide. So I think that that disconnect needs to be somehow dealt with. And certainly starting with simple things like how we're adjusting our diet to a healthier way of eating become important.
And it's interesting for me, we were speaking before we started recording, and I said, even in this day and age with emerging information authors like yourself, clinicians, the concept of nutritional psychiatry is still not as well known as I hope it will be, moving forward. And
Right.
so helping your patients and our listeners understand the complex interrelationship between the foods that we eat, which can either foster the health of our gut and
Mm.
producing healthy neurotransmitters, which do impact mood quite significantly. But the other piece of this that I think is quite significant is that we know that anxiety in and of itself can put us at greater risk for other types of physical ailments, disorders,
Yes.
metabolic disease in particular. Can we speak to
Hmm.
this just a little bit? Because I think that this, in and of itself, is a very important concept for listeners to understand as they are navigating getting help for themselves, their loved ones, or family or friends.
Some data shows, Cynthia, that about 88% of Americans have some abnormal metabolic symptom or factor. That doesn't mean full metabolic syndrome, but some sort of issue. And part of it is our food system, our level of stress, environment, so many different things. But I think when it comes to metabolism and anxiety, one of the things we need to start to understand is that mental health and our metabolic health are shown and being shown to really be inextricably linked. So if we're eating a diet that is high in, say, the standard American diet called SAD for a reason, which actually has a lot of high highly processed, ultra processed foods and high in fast food, junk foods, but also high in sugar, an ingredient either through high fructose corn syrup or other natural or unnatural sugars found in our foods. Um, we are just naturally eating a diet that is pushing us towards type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance. The thing to catch here is that the moment our metabolism is tipped over towards being unhealthy, it can actually set off things like anxiety and mood symptoms. And I often see these in conjunction. So, anything that we can do to clean up our diet, so taking it in a simple way, just taking one food that you know is not the healthiest option, can you swap that out with a healthier version? Can you give it up or cut back on it in a way that doesn't make you feel deprived, but you're eating a healthier version of it? Let's just take something like, say, you love store-bought chicken nuggets, right? May not be that much chicken in them and a lot of highly processed ingredients. Doesn't mean you have to give them up. Can you make a healthier version at home in your air fryer? Can you try to do it in a different way? Can you maybe, omit the breadcrumbs and find a crispy way to eat the chicken? Or maybe it's tofu that you like and some sort of dish that you eat at a restaurant, but when you look up a recipe or you ask them, there's a lot of sugar added to that to make that flavorful, spicy taste. But I think it's about finding the healthier swaps, and starting there becomes important.
Well, and it's interesting. I've come to find that if we meet our patients where they are, we oftentimes have much greater success. And so I love that you're starting with, something that I think most Americans have probably consumed, if not once or twice or more often, like chicken nuggets, and just saying, I'm not telling you not to eat chicken nuggets. Let's just find the healthiest version of that food that you crave or you're interested in consuming. And I think for a lot of individuals, they assume that when they're in a restaurant or in the grocery store, if unless you're reading food labels, you may not even realize how unhealthy some of the foods are that are in our
Yeah.
food supply without even going down the kind of proverbial rabbit hole about subsidized foods. And as you mentioned appropriately, there's a lot of excess sugar throughout the ultra
Mhm.
processed food
Yeah.
industry. And I think as people start realizing what's in their food, that greater awareness will help with making better food choices.
You're absolutely right, Cynthia. And one of the things I want to kind of underline for people here is that we are up against food marketing and the food companies who market those foods in a way to us to make us think that they're healthy. And that doesn't go for every single food across the board, but it goes for many foods. And we just need to be a little bit more savvy about looking at those food labels and discerning for ourselves, is that truly healthy? Just because it has this label? So I think understanding what is a healthy version of a food. Uh, Let me just mention, cauliflower, broccoli, cruciferous vegetables, some of my favorites are having a moment. They're in pizza crusts to nuggets to you can get any version of them. Doesn't mean that they're healthy. Look at the ingredient list and may just be worth your while buying those vegetables even frozen, because flash frozen in this country are actually pretty healthy options for us, and making something at home that's a healthy version of that.
What do you think contributes to many of our patients' lack of understanding on how to do basic cooking skills? I think if we encourage our patients to cook at home, they're like, first of all, I never learned how to cook food at all. I
Right,
have been largely dependent on just going to the grocery store or
right,
ordering takeout because, food prep at home is hard. It doesn't need to be. What are
right.
some of the largest impediments that you find when you're talking to your patients about cooking at home, which we know is one of the best ways to help support making better choices?
You're absolutely right on that, and it's been shown in large database studies as well that we eat healthier and consume fewer calories, and even may lose weight when we cook our meals at home. One of the biggest impediments is I think that people feel it's too hard, it's too difficult to do something, and for that reason, in both my books, Calm Your Mind with Food is my second book, and my first book, This to Brain on Food, the last chapter is always recipes. And I go in the most simple way to help people be encouraged to even use a microwave if they have to make a scrambled egg in a mug. Now, do I like microwave cooking all the time? No. But if you're really stuck and you know that you arrive at work with 5 minutes to spare and you don't generally get to make your breakfast ahead, this is a solution for you. Or same for dinner or lunch, whatever that meal might be. They think it's too difficult and they think it's a skill set that is above where they're at. But you can start very simply by just buying your favorite vegetables and chopping them up. You can start very simply by cooking something that you enjoy. Say you like eggs, or say you like those chicken nuggets, or say you like tofu, whatever it is that you might enjoy. Maybe look up a simple recipe, watch someone doing it online, and realize that, influencers on Instagram and chefs and all of that, they do this for a living. So their skill and expertise is going to look beautiful and look very easy, but you can start somewhere. I know this because as a child, I grew up in a family where everyone cooked. So I had grandmothers, aunts, older cousins that prepared the food, and I really could mostly be spoiled and just enjoy the food. So I started cooking later, and I had to learn those skills. I Granted, I enjoy cooking, so I went to it just as I was willing to get by any bad dishes that I started with. But you have to start somewhere. So just get a chopping board, choose a knife that you can work with. These are not expensive. You can even get these at your supermarket, and kind of get cooking with something simple.
Yeah, and I think you so appropriately mentioned the social media influencers, because if we just view our nutritional intake based on what we see others doing, an Instagram worthy photo that meal has probably been duplicated 50 times to find the right photo, the right angle, the right lighting.
You're
And I
correct.
oftentimes will say to my husband, I'm less concerned about presentation. I'm more concerned about
Yes.
taste. And so helping everyone understand, like, as an example, on days where I am very busy, like in between
Mhm,
podcasting, I sometimes will
mhm,
cook up 2 pounds of ground bison, not to eat in one
mhm.
serving. My teenagers could do
Great,
that. And some days it may be, hamburger salad. It may be I put some
great.
greens down, I put the cooked bison or beef on top of it. Maybe I
Hmm.
add some dressing, maybe I don't. I add some vegetables. It doesn't
Great.
look like an Instagram worthy meal, but it's delicious. It's clean. I've made it at home
And it's clean. Yeah.
and it's
And it's
super
nutritious.
easy.
I think that's such an
Exactly.
excellent point because we're so influenced by the things we see. And I think we just need to be comfortable with the fact that, to your point, it just needs to be nutritious, healthy, actual food, not a store-bought version of it that's frozen and has gone through multiple machines to be made. Just actual food where you know what's in it. And some easy tips are things like buying frozen vegetables and frozen berries. Like I said, they're flash frozen. These are easy. So you don't have to clean the whole cauliflower. You don't have to clean all of the broccoli. Canned beans, legumes, canned seafood. This is also speaks to the affordability issue. Wild caught salmon is not within your price range or your budget. Wild caught canned salmon. Or canned beans, and I'm referring to things like lentils and not so much lentils, but more chickpeas and black beans, for example. Rinse them out and use them. These are cost effective and nutritious for you. And ways that you can, even over greens or a big salad that you literally don't have to cook and just throw together, easy additions.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of keeping things really simple. Let's speak to the impact of nutrition and mental health. Let's talk about the physiology between the brain and the gut, this whole concept of the enteric brain, all the neurons that I found this fascinating as I was navigating your book, this bidirectional relationship between the gut and the brain and why it's so important. It's not just yes, it is important to eat healthy food, but understanding there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, if you will, in terms of the interrelationship between the gut and the brain and mental health.
I think the biggest issue is people don't make that connection. They are always associating how we eat with, often weight gain, or maybe a family history of some type of medical condition that where their food has been or nutrition plan has been suggested, like say type 2 diabetes or hypertension. The gut and brain originate from the exact same cell line in the human embryo. They divide apart, they form these two separate organs, but they're not really separate because A, they originate from the same place, and B, they remain connected by the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. And what that does is it is a two-way messaging system from chemical neurotransmitters that are happening all of the time. And so I like people to realize that the serotonin receptors and other neurotransmitter receptors are many parts of the body, including the brain. But 90 to 95% of serotonin receptors are in the gut. We call serotonin our happiness hormone. It's definitely associated with anxiety and mood. So when you consume food, anything that you eat is being digested in your let's say your digestive tract. There are trillions of microbes in the large intestine mostly, and they are helping with this digestive process. So when you are eating the healthy salad you mentioned, the microbes are happy, they're nourished, they're getting fiber, they're getting vitamins, nutrients, mineral, protein, everything that you need, healthy carbs, and they are thriving, they're helping you. So when they help to break down the food, not only are they interacting in the same environment as the neurotransmitters, they are forming healthy products called short chain fatty acids, which really fend off inflammation, fend off oxidative stress, and are healthy for your body. So you're fending off inflammation in your gut. On the other hand, if what you're eating is fast food every day, a lot of candy, ice cream, and chocolate, and just, more, let's say, more of a sweet tooth, but also more processed, ultra processed foods, then the microbes in the gut that are going to thrive are the negative ones, the ones that drive inflammation, cause problems, and cause dysbiosis in the gut. And when that happens, it tips over the balance. It leads to, over time, conditions like leaky gut because it damages this delicate cell lining of the gut and enters your circulatory system. And inflammation in the gut leads to inflammation in the brain. And these two are connected. So your eating is not just affecting the waistline, it's affecting your brain, it's affecting your neurons, it's affecting many parts of your body, but it is specifically impacting your mental well-being.
And in terms of working with women that are navigating perimenopause and menopause, do you see an uptick in reported symptoms of anxiety? We speak a lot on the podcast about the changes that occur with, the poor ovarian reserve as we're navigating the transition from perimenopause to menopause, and how progesterone in particular, if it's not at appropriate levels, can exacerbate underlying anxiety. But in your clinical experience, what are some of the common concerns that women at this stage of life in particular will express to you?
For one thing, there's just anxiety about approaching perimenopause. It's perhaps they had a mother or sister or cousin that had, uncomfortable symptoms and perhaps wasn't able to get the best advice and suffered through that. So they might be angst related to that. They may be angst related to the changes in our body that happen over perimenopause and menopause. And the things that come with it that we have heard are not that cool and not that fun. So there's a lot of preconceived ideas about it. But what they tend to complain about is really feeling uncomfortable in their body, feeling more moodiness, poor sleep, not only because of some of the physical symptoms like hot flashes, but also really an uptick of anxiety. And some of that is, the natural hormonal changes that they're undergoing. Plus, they worry about these symptoms. But it could also be because as they're going through some of these changes in their body, they tend to be craving or feeling like eating certain foods, which feel like a source of comfort for them. But often those foods are not the healthiest and they are discomfort for the brain. So guiding them towards, well, we know how you're feeling. What can we do again to swap, to clean up, to cut back, not give up something, not saying give up something you really enjoy, just eat less of it or find a healthy swap. And I can help you do that. That's, part of the way that just creating recipes or alternates for people can make them feel less deprived. But anxiety is huge and often associated with those problems with sleep.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me just, when I started as a nurse practitioner in my 20s and I saw so many women in their 40s really struggling and not yet having enough of a profound appreciation for what they were experiencing. Now, being on the other side, I think, oh my goodness, now I understand so many of those women were struggling because there really was this lack of understanding about how impacted, and it's so bio individual. That's the other thing. You could take 10 women and they could all have a very different experience navigating
Exactly.
perimenopause and menopause. And so I at that time lived in an area of the country that was there was a lot of traffic. People were, involved in very stressful jobs, and almost every single woman in that vulnerable time period of perimenopause, sleep apnea, insomnia, on multiple medications to help them navigate some of the changes they were experiencing. So thank you for speaking to that. I'd love to pivot and talk about the gut microbiome. I think that this is an area of medical research and information that when both of us were training, there was no information. Now there's been an
Yes.
explosion over the past,
Hmm.
17 years. Let's talk about why the microbiota is so important and how current research is helping navigate changes around how we can best support this part of our microbiome.
Um, I think that one of the things people don't realize is that the science is evolving very rapidly between about 2012 and 2017. There were like 12,000 articles on the gut microbiome just in that time frame. Um, and so once the research started, it really took off. And we know much more than we did about mental health in the microbiome. For example, since one of the things we're touching on is anxiety, we know that GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And when GABA levels are low, the parts of the brain, like the amygdala, can be more reactive and respond to stress differently. So GABA is actually shown to be produced by certain gut microbes, and the species is called Bifidobacterium adolescentes. So any imbalance in the gut, say you're eating poorly and you're eating those fast foods, that gut imbalance can lead to a shortage of this species. And a shortage of the species means less GABA in the gut and the brain, and therefore an increased level of anxiety. So, there are fascinating things that have been studied in not only different groups of microbes, but their impact on actual neurotransmitters. So I think that becomes important for us to understand. But along with that is the fact that the food we eat uh, is impacting these microbes in different ways, and therefore impacting our mental health in now a little bit more specific ways of targeting these different, say, microbial groups or bifidobacterium or lactobacillus, and we therefore are understanding much more. So while it's not prescriptive, we do understand that there are healthier principles that will help support those gut microbes and overall help our mental health. And then now we're also understanding more specifics as well.
I think one of the things that I have found so fascinating about the gut microbiome and the research is that something like jet lag can change the gut microbiome quite profoundly and significantly. And so when people are traveling overseas, or as an example, I'm going to be in LA tomorrow, I will be 3 hours behind, and I'm someone that does fine when I go east and I struggle when I go west. It's just the way that my body works,
Right.
but understanding that even kind of acute things, individuals that work shift work, how many healthcare practitioners, healthcare providers,
Yes.
or cops, or EMS ambulance, or even people that do construction in overnight hours, understanding that that degree of hormetic stress, brief, potentially
Mhm.
beneficial stress, can have a large net impact on the gut microbiome. And I would love to touch on sugar, which we know sugar exacerbates underlying anxiety. But now there's the advent of all these non-nutritive sweeteners, sucralose,
Mm.
aspartame. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on how this impacts the gut microbiome? I know some of the research is suggesting it can impact, insulin sensitivity, metabolic health. But what have you
Mm.
seen clinically with your own patients?
So, clinically, I find that the foods that are marked sugar-free and the older sweeteners, like the ones you mentioned, are problematic. They're not, firstly, they're non-nutritive. And so they trick our bodies into thinking that that food is coming. And sometimes people don't realize that they actually gain weight when they're starting to eat these so-called sugar-free foods or drinking a lot of diet soda. And part of that is the way that they work. They are ultra sweet. They trick the body into thinking that sugar is on its way because it activates the taste receptors. But then sugar doesn't come. You feel hypoglycemic. You have a sugar crash, and then you want to eat more. So it's an interesting one of the different mechanisms that's been looked at. So I think that overall these older artificial sweeteners that are in many of our foods actually are problematic because they're disruptive to the gut and they drive these types of cravings. It may cause us to gain weight. I see this a lot. So I generally guide people towards some of the newer sweeteners, but very little. And I have them, and the example I like to use is sweeteners are, yes, they exist as options for baking, but that's not a good idea because you're using a lot more of a very highly sweet um, sweetener into your baking. So I'd much rather you just, can always give you alternatives for what you're trying to make. But that's an example where I think that it'd be providing a solution, but not one that's ultimately healthy for people. Even if that particular sweetener in a little bit in your tea or coffee or is okay. I'm just saying don't have it 10 times a day. I'm not, and I'm also saying don't drink those diet sodas and diet drinks because they are pumped up with those artificial sweeteners. But if you need to sweeten your tea, there's some new ones which are less problematic in terms of insulin resistance. Erythritol, certainly stevia has not been as problematic. But again, stevia is a bit complicated because stevia can worsen anxiety, even though it's natural, and yet it can help. It can be okay in small amounts for some people. So it's always, you mentioned by individuality, and that's so key to what we're talking about. So a little bit, a newer sweetener, don't use it all the time, and try to maybe do with less of it. And most certainly don't be buying all the sugar-free products with it because that's just going to be super disruptive to your gut.
Yeah, and it's interesting and how many times I have gone to events and either listened to colleagues speak or been asked this question, what's the best sugar substitute? Because I think many people, whether it's just the sensitization of our palates, given the processed food industry and how sugar has infiltrated every condiment, everything that we eat, with very few exceptions, if we don't make it at home, has probably been touched by some type of sugar alcohol or sugar product.
Mm.
And so many people are looking for like the next best thing. You know, the non-nutritive
Mhm.
sweeteners seem pretty benign. And I would agree with you and echo what you're saying that they themselves can become problematic and can impact the gut microbiome in profound and significant ways. When we're talking about neuroinflammation, and we're dovetailing into this conversation because I think that this is very interesting to me, the changes that are going on with the gut microbiome, this bidirectional relationship with our brain, but helping listeners understand the concept of neuroinflammation, how stress plays a role in that, and what is going on physiologically in the brain when it is inflamed, because this will help people identify some of the symptoms that they are experiencing that they may want to discuss with their healthcare provider.
The way that neuroinflammation can show up clinically, one of the ways that it starts is your level of stress. Perhaps you are feeling stressed and therefore you're eating poorly. We know that stress precipitates habit circuits in the brain. So it is actually true if you are stressed and you're starting to order fast foods every day for all of your meals because it just becomes easier because you're stressed and worried, or maybe work is tough right now. It you start craving it and you want more of it. There's a lot of engineering that goes into our food. There's a lot of research and development to actually perpetuate those cravings. So be aware of that. So, you're feeling stressed, your cortisol levels go through the roof, your HPA axis is thrown off. And where you're at is you sort of craving these less healthy foods. Because let's face it, no one's eating broccoli when they're stressed, and no one's rushing to that great leafy green salad. Mostly it's the candy, the chocolates, whatever it is, the ice cream. So realize that, we have to kind of step back from that cycle. But the moment that, we talked early on about this gut brain connection, the moment that inflammation starts to be set up in the gut, um, the inflammation in the gut will reach the brain. Once there's damage to the single cell lining of the gut, it's very delicate. And once that is permeated, the dysbiosis, the toxic breakdown products, that the negative microbes, which are not forming short chain fatty acids, they are forming more toxic polysaccharides. Those leak into the circulatory system. And guess what? It reaches all parts of your body, but it reaches your brain. And so when you start to develop neuroinflammation, I will often, what I will see clinically, if I were to trace back someone's diet, is an uptick of symptoms, worsened anxiety, new anxiety in a person who's not had anxiety before. So a lot of that in the pandemic with kind of the less healthy. Some people thrived during the pandemic and started exercising more, cooking at home. And those are another group, a larger group that struggled more. So with some of those individuals, I mean, they will naturally just experience almost new symptoms when they haven't really been so overtly anxious before. They've been able to manage it. Same thing with mood. So there's definitely a connection. This is where food is a pillar, but even things like a breathwork exercise, a mindfulness practice that appeals to you, outdoor time, simple things, working out, just being more active. These are all part of the same puzzle. It's an integrated and holistic approach. Well, whereas food is the pillar, and I think it's the one that we most overlook. Things like sleep and exercise and getting into the best routine also become important. Also, things like hydration, because if someone's dehydrated, they can feel very anxious and not realize it.
Yeah, I love that you are thinking about this from a very comprehensive lens, from as I'm watching you drink water, all the way from dehydration, driving anxiety, to the food choices that we're making and understanding what's going on physiologically when we're stressed. I always tell people you're going to crave salt or sugar or maybe both. And appropriately, you don't crave chicken and broccoli. You're probably going to crave the bag of chips, the ice cream, but understanding that there is a physiologic drive to do that. Your body is looking for a way to increase serotonin. Sometimes I find this fascinating that,
Yes.
when I was still getting a menstrual cycle, there was a time in my cycle where I would always crave chocolate, and I would say to myself,
Hmm.
I need more magnesium, because that was always my
Right.
my indicator or my sign. And so for people listening, understanding that what's going on in our personal lives can directly impact what's going on in terms of our stress. And to your point as well, talking about new onset anxiety could be a clue that something else is going on. Maybe you were traveling, you picked up a parasite, or maybe you have a new underlying food sensitivity that is driving some of these leaky gut symptoms. Now, when I think about the brain and I think about hormones and I think about cravings, one of the big hormones that I know we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast, but is relevant to our conversation, is talking about leptin, this very,
Hmm.
very important hormone. Can we speak to how it impacts food cravings, can impact anxiety levels, and also understanding that there are some gender differences as well, that, men and women may have more or less leptin circulating just based on our gender roles?
True. So it's often overlooked, but leptin is, the hormone that helps tell us that we're satiated. So it's I like to tell people that when you're eating, it's the hormone that kind of reminds you that, I've had a plate of food, I've enjoyed my dinner, and now it's time to move on, take a walk, or whatever your next activity is, or however, maybe you have some berries as um, to help with that sweet tooth. But when we're eating in a way that is leading to leptin resistance, meaning that it won't be able to create the correct signals, and we are behaving in a way, and that behavior may be the stress that gets set up that we talked about. It might be the cravings that have gotten set up that's leading you to just eat poorly. We can actually really set off um, uh, or allow without meaning to that we start to develop leptin resistance. And when that hormone does not remind us to shut off our eating, we eat more, we continue, we get that second plate of food. We then reach for, more berries than we need because berries are healthy, but they do contain sugar. So eating a ton of them in one sitting or one day is not the healthiest. It's all about the balance and bioindividuality. So I think understanding that these are delicate hormone systems that get impacted by how we eat is really key to helping us step back from things like anxiety and helping us almost rebalance our physiology and our metabolism to help calm ourselves. And it's something that works if we pay attention.
Yeah. And even in the book, you talk about when leptin is properly functioning, it can have a calming
Mhm,
effect on the brain. So if your leptin signaling or your leptin levels are optimized, you are less likely to experience anxiety. So that was a big takeaway that, more often
yes,
than not, when things are balanced, and I hate the word balance because balance is elusive, but for the
it's true.
context of our conversation, helping
Right.
people understand that when we are satiated, when we have the appropriate amount of circulating leptin, we are going to be able to push
Mhm,
that meal, push the table, push ourselves away from the table, feel satiated.
mhm,
We're not thinking about a candy bar or the ice cream. We're able to go about our day. And then the opposite is true that for some individuals, when they have a lot of cravings, when they are feeling very anxious and depressed, or even in the book, you talk about OCD, obsessive compulsiveness, it can be a
mhm,
sign that your leptin levels are not optimized. Now, I know a lot of our focus today is talking about the interrelationship between nutrition and mood and how we feel, but I would love to talk about the misappropriation of fats. You and I both trained in a time when fats were effectively bastardized. We were told fat is bad.
mhm.
Let's talk about healthy fats, the fats that you like to encourage your patients to consume, and then the fats to avoid.
Right. So, this relates back to the food industry, food labeling, food marketing, and phases in this country, right? So, there was a phase when, our mothers were buying low fat milk and skim milk and a low fat everything from cheese to anything that could be low fat, and finding all sorts of substitutes for things like butter, including things like margarine that were used extensively. So what the food industry did is, because the so-called low-fat craze happened, um, they took out the fat, but they put in carbohydrates or sugars to increase the flavor. Because fat is also flavor. If you cook, you know that. And so it was something that was incredibly unhealthy for us because while it was labeled low fat, the calories were coming in through other sources like carbohydrates and different forms of sugar. And as time evolved, there've been different phases and crazes, but I was very interested in a study that was published actually in 2020. Now, granted, many phases of the rethinking around fat have happened, but this particular study was published in the JACC and was one of the most cited, if not the most cited that year. And they looked at almost a reworking and relooking at saturated fats. So, it used to be that you told people, um, you know, go towards lean poultry and lean meats and don't eat beef, um, or red meats, I should say. And the issue is that a certain amount of saturated fat is completely okay for you. It's not going to kill you, and I'm not saying you should eat beef every day, but I'm saying well sourced red meat is completely okay. It's not, this may not be something that your cardiologist tells you. I often talk to my colleagues and they're not in agreement with it. So I think it's about bioindividuality, creating the right sort of formula for what works for your body, and understanding that these food rules that have marketing behind them and food companies behind them are not the best for us. So we've got to sort of look at the world. We've got to learn a little bit about how to read food labels. We've got to become savvy about what's a healthy version of something. Those broccoli nuggets are not quite the healthiest version. Just get the broccoli, eat the broccoli, and that a small amount of when I say small amounts, Cynthia, simply because I don't want people to sort of sway in the other direction and say, sure, butter's great. I'm going to cook everything in butter. And that's fine if you're metabolically healthy, but many of us are not. So when you're metabolically healthy and metabolically flexible, so you're at a good healthy weight, you are exercising, you have all of these different things that you're doing, and your body is, no one's perfect, but you're in let's say you're in good shape overall. Then if you ate a lot of red meat or ate a lot of butter, your body can take it because you're exercising, you're metabolically fit. You are, when you exercise, you burn off that fat. So you can take it. But for many of us, right, that 88%, that's why I speak about eating it in moderation. It's not that you have to demonize it or never eat it again, but just have good sources if you can afford it. Eat it in moderation, and same thing with butter. So the fats that I like are things like extra virgin olive oil for my salad dressings, avocado oil for, say, I'm roasting vegetables. I love using an air fry, in which case you don't need any fat to be added, and a touch of coconut oil. I love ghee, which is clarified butter, and actually a little lob of butter if I'm cooking something that I want the flavor in. But because I have to watch my health, I don't put a ton of butter, in everything. And so it's about that creating what works for you.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful explanation. And I will remind patients when we're looking, like, calories matter to a point. It's not the whole
Yes,
picture,
it's
but
not the whole picture. Yeah.
helping people understand that, protein and carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram and fat is 9. So fat tends to be much more calorically dense. You appropriately said, it's what drives flavor. It's very pleasing to the palate. So sometimes being conscientious about portions, for many of us, and myself included, I have to be mindful of my portions of healthy fats. I can generally do fine with protein and carbohydrates. Now, I also feel like carbs have gotten a bad rap. And I say this about the healthy carbs, that there are some people who are now paranoid to eat a piece of fruit. They demonize the
Yeah.
vegetables.
Mhm.
Helping your patients and listeners understand that there are healthy carbohydrates, and these are the ones we want to consume. And then there are the unhealthy processed variety that we want to limit as much as possible. You mentioned the chicken nuggets, eat the chicken, avoid the breading. But helping people understand that there are high quality carbohydrates. There's this glycemic index that you do talk about in the book. Let's kind of differentiate, give listeners some examples of low glycemic index and higher glycemic index foods to help them understand.
Sure. So let's start off with the with carbohydrates, because I think that one of the things people don't understand is that things like cauliflower can be classified and not classified as a carbohydrate, but they are a more complex, healthy carbohydrate compared to a donut, which is largely sugar and highly processed flour that makes the donut, and then there's a ton of sugar. So we just want to be careful about understanding that our bodies need sugar, our bodies need carbohydrates. We are bio individuals, so what you eat and I eat may need to be different based on our genetics, physiology, environment, so many things, gut microbiome, etc. But I think where people get a little bit misguided is don't ever eat fruit because fruit contains sugar. Yes, fruit contains sugar, but fruit contains fiber and multiple nutrients and vitamins. So eating fruit in moderation, a quarter cup of berries, a piece of apple, a clementine, these are good ways and good foods that your body needs, and they balance your gut. They help. They help with the fiber content. They are healthy for us, and we should be eating certain number of servings of fruit in a day, not fruit juice. That's a totally different product, and not dumping a ton of berries into a smoothie all the time. By all means, put a few berries in your smoothie. Make it sweet that way. Totally fine, but sometimes we go to stores or we go to places that sell these breakfast bowls with multiple different types of fruit and frozen yogurt. It's actually a sugar bomb. So, and just understand eating it in moderation becomes important. Um, and understanding that if you have a donut, I always say to people, why do they tend to sell donuts? And like, the little special, we have these two donuts with this cup of coffee or whatever it is, because you usually want that second donut. You eat the donut, it's gone through your system so fast that you need a second one. Um, that is the nature of simple carbohydrates. They break down very fast. They cause a blood sugar spike. You are not satiated. You want another donut, or you want something else to eat, because if you've chosen that for breakfast, you're not full and you remain hungry. Very different if you had eggs with spinach in them, or maybe you had scrambled tofu with lots of veggies in them, and you maybe had a piece of avocado for healthy fat with that. Whatever it was, that's a little bit more wholesome than what you ate. When it comes to higher glycemic products, um, it's the processed, ultra processed flours that we use in our store-bought bread, the ones that are shelf stable and are highly processed, and tend to be what a lot of people use for sandwiches. These are less healthy for us, and it's hard to step away from a habit that we have, but just finding healthier versions. Maybe there's a bakery that makes sourdough bread that you can find in your neighborhood, or maybe there is a recipe you can find for a more I've seen recipes that are pretty easy for like a cracker, but made from nuts and seeds. And so you're not adding a ton of ultra processed flours, because the ultra processed flours have almost no fiber or actual wheat left. They're really stripped of their nutrients. So I think that just finding those choices for ourselves become really important.
Yeah. And I think, again, you really do a beautiful job of meeting patients where they are, identifying that there are these fun foods like the donut, the bread, and finding healthier alternatives. Why do you think so many of us struggle with getting enough fiber in our diet? And why is fiber so important for our gut microbiome and our mental health?
Many of us struggle to get fiber because of the standard American diet, which is not rich in fiber. Ultra processed and processed foods tend not to contain that much fiber in them. Um, and so we have to be conscious of where we get our fiber. Fiber is easily obtained from vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, healthy whole grains, not from animal or seafood protein. So fiber, just having adequate vegetables in your diet in some way, shape, or form becomes important for obtaining the fiber that your body needs. Why does your body need it? Because our gut microbes thrive on fiber. That's their fodder. That's what they eat. So if you take care of your gut microbiome, tap into a diversity of different vegetables, different colors, different textures. Have fun with it. Start expanding your palate. Add in proteins from beans and nuts and seeds, because that brings you fiber. But I think that where people get waylaid is we tending to eat a less healthy diet, and it is high in processed ingredients and sugars, but is not high in the type of fiber that our body needs. But it's easy to fix, because we just have to lean into more salads and vegetables every day as part of whatever else you eat.
Yeah, I know. I had Dr. Robin Chutkin on last year, and she was encouraging listeners to have 30 plants per week. And that could
Yes, I
be
love that one.
herbs,
Yeah,
spices. So understanding
they
that
all
you could have
count.
right, you
Yeah.
could have a salad with 8 different elements and you could knock 8 out just like that. And I think understanding that fiber plays this role as like the fertilizer for the microbes in the gut is super helpful. And if anyone's listening and saying, well, I tried to have a cup of Brussels sprouts and it made me bloated and gassy. Sometimes it's dosage dependent. Sometimes it is that you need to start with half a cup or maybe half a cup or a quarter cup of a particular vegetable until your body kind of gets acclimated. Now, I want to make sure that we at least touch on a very popular subject. You talk about it in the book as well, the rise of plant-based protein. In the book, you talk about how veganism has increased 600% from 2014 to
Mhm.
2018, and that plant-based labeling has increased 287% in the past 10 years. And what I loved is that you're looking for balance. You know, we talk about balance being elusive, but you even
Hmm.
speak to the fact that there's no definitive evidence for either veganism or omnivorous diets in terms of anxiety. So for everyone that's listening, depending on which side of that you fall on, which argument, what works best for you, it's really figuring out that bioindividuality piece. But for you as a clinician, as you've been witnessing the rise of plant-based focused proteins, et cetera, have you seen any differences within your patient population depending on which direction they go in for their protein, whether it's animal, plant-based, a combination of both?
I really think that what I've learned in my practice over time is by individuality is so much where it's at. I think we're knowing that now, we're understanding that precision and personalized medicine, that a nutritional lifestyle and metabolic psychiatry treatment plan has got to be suited to that individual. But one of the things I want to point out to both sides of this argument are so I'm vegetarian just from birth. I was born into a vegetarian family. So for me, that was kind of decided for me. And it never bothered me because as a chef, I cook anything and members of my family eat anything. But one of the things I remember years ago when I visited, I was so excited because there are these new vegan restaurants in New York. And this is not recent, they've much improved since then. Everything was deep fried. Every type of vegetable in this vegan restaurant was deep fried. And I remember thinking, I wanted the vegetables, but is this really the best way for me to eat them? And of course, I knew they were not. So I think we've come a long way from that. I think that there are many more restaurants and options and recipes and people who can teach you how to eat a healthy plant based diet. An individual needs to do what's best for their body. That is the bottom line. And some of my patients have needed to switch away from eating as much meat and build in more of those plants, the diversity for their gut microbiome. Others have actually wanted to eat more of a vegetarian diet. But if we're doing that, we got to make sure that it has balance in other ways, right? And that if they say giving up meat, red meat and chicken, that they're getting protein, adequate protein in other sources, because not many people know how to do that well. Um, and I think that the kind of fads we go through, where there's a rush towards protein is the most important thing, or this is what you should be doing, confuse people the most, and that's where we just throw off all of that balance. So I think whatever the diet is, whether you a pescatarian, vegan, or just vegetarian, and maybe you do consume things like a touch of honey or some dairy if you eat dairy, there's a way to find that balance. And I think the more we can embrace that, the healthier, happier, and less anxious we will be as a country. And I mean that because the more that we fall into, you, Cynthia, you should never eat that bison, you need to be giving it up. Well, you eat it, you enjoy it, you're thriving, your family's doing well with it. That's a choice. I think we really just need to be more inclusive with food, and I think giving hard and fast food rules to individuals, whether you're carnivore or vegan, it's the same thing on different sides. And I think when people feel split that way, I see my patients and people in my practice really struggle.
Well, such a beautiful message. I can't thank you enough for our conversation today. Please let listeners know how to connect with you on social media, how to get access to your new book.
Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks for having me. So the best way is to go to my website, umanaidoomd.com, where you'll see a ton of fun stuff, actually. You'll see my books. You'll see a link for my course that helps other clinicians, practitioners, or just if you're a listener wanting to be healthier, learn more about nutritional uses in your mental health. I have a new meal delivery service with the daily dose meals. It's called Mood Food Meals. And you will find that link on my website as well. It's freshly delivered food for 3 to 5 days of the week based on my recipes, using my spices, and ideas for sort of a balanced meal for that or whether it's lunch, dinner, or your breakfast. And check me out on social media at DRUMANAIDOO. And I'm an instructor at Masterclass. So we have a new brain health masterclass that was just released around Father's Day. Check that out as well if you want to dive deep into brain health and mental health.
Wonderful. Thank you again for your time today. Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
We make almost all of our fat cells during childhood and puberty. And then once we finish puberty, we're done. That number of fat cells, in most people, there are some people who are an exception to this, and that's about 15% of people who are in the obese category. But most people reach a limit, and that's their fat cell number essentially for adulthood.